3, take 3. Okay, let me check and make sure I am live. Go back to my channel. No, I don't want to play a mix. I want to see if I am live. Okay, my computer working. Let me look on my computer. View your channel. Sorry, guys. Yep, part 3. Yep, part 3. Showing I am live. Okay. I should have been on my phone internet in the beginning, but I wasn't. Okay, part 3. I'm going to go ahead and pick up where we left off. It was on 21, marker 2117, before we buffered. So let me get to that part. It won't take long. And I'll go back to 21, period. Yeah, 2102. I'll do that just in case it started buffering way before then. So let's start from right here. Okay, take 3 and action. Not a TV buffering.
Deaf to it. And so I will respond even though I'm in the other room because I'm so much more sensitive to the clamoring for attention. This is like the body in response to insulin. If there is always insulin, it's always going up, the body will start to say, the muscle cell will start to say, boy, insulin, you are knocking on my door all the time. This is getting old. I'm not responding anymore. I'm not going to listen as much as I was before. So in that sense, insulin, too much insulin becomes a cause of insulin resistance. And back to what I said earlier, I could take you into the lab, start infusing you with just a little drip of insulin to increase your insulin, and over just a few hours, you would become demonstrably less sensitive to it than you were before we started. But again, as I take that away, give your body a few hours and it's back to normal. In every one of those instances, it's a fast onset and it's also a fast solution if we can take it away.
If we can take it away, but if we can't take it away, does it become sort of chronic?
Yeah, so that especially, all of these can contribute to a more lingering insulin resistance, but especially insulin, where I focus on that one the most because of not only its relevance to the slow lane, but also just how present it is, where 70% of all calories globally are carbohydrates. And now, perhaps with the best of intentions, our experts are telling us that we should be eating 6 times a day. And so we wake up in the morning, insulin has finally been coming down while we've been fasting overnight.
I remember us going over this part.
We're fasting. Then we break that fast by eating breakfast. And in the UK, as it is in the US, by and large, this is going to be a very starchy, sugary breakfast. It's toast with some jam, or it's cereal, or it's bagels. That is almost pure glucose. And so what do? We wake up, we eat breakfast, we spike our blood sugar levels, and insulin has to come up. Insulin will take longer to come down than the blood sugar will. It will wait in the blood to make sure that all the blood sugar has gone back to normal. So depending on how much carbohydrate we ate for breakfast, it could take our insulin levels 3 or even 4 hours to come back down to normal. Long before it's had a chance to come back down to normal, we've had a mid-morning snack, of course. We need to go get a sugary coffee and another bagel or something. And so after just a couple hours, we do it again. And once again, before insulin has had a chance to come back down, we have a starchy, carbohydrate-heavy lunch, then an afternoon snack, and then a carbohydrate-heavy dinner, and then of course we have to have an evening snack before we go to bed. So the average individual is spending every waking moment in a state of elevated insulin, and thus the signal never really goes away.
So I stopped earlier. I stopped at this point earlier when I was in part one. When we were in my car, I stopped earlier for part one to kind of like elaborate on this a little bit, because I was saying how to explain this, give another example for you to explain, for you to understand, is to how we always have been taught, breakfast is the most important meal of the day, because that's when we are breaking the fast. That's our first meal after we have supposedly given our body time to rest from the added stress that we put on it from eating. And so, if you have been listening and following along with our research in several of my Gumbo Garden videos, we talked about, or we researched and found out that several people or several researchers say that the first thing that you should do when you wake up in the morning is drink some water. Or if you look at Ari Leonard, his recommendation, that's one of the Jamaican herbalists that we research, he recommend that the first thing you drink in the morning is coconut water. But hey, Albert, welcome in. But what we do is we get up in the morning, and the first thing that we probably eat is this really high sugar, carb packed breakfast, right? And most of it is probably simple carbs, which is not the good ones. So, which is basically essentially a rapid uptake of sugar. And so, what we're doing is essentially shocking our body back up right after it's been resting. So, to give an analogy, if you haven't exercised for years, would you start on your first day, go outside and say, okay, I'm deciding this gonna be my first day. I'm gonna start back exercising. Would you start off running? No, that's a no brainer, right? You wouldn't do that because number one, you probably couldn't do it. And number two, you already know the damaging effects. You could possibly unalive yourself from trying to do that. And you'll put on so much stress on your body to try to do that. That's just not wise, right? So why do we do that to our body? We don't, because we don't know. We don't know that's what we're doing. But in essence, that's what you're doing after you haven't eaten for, and it's not just breakfast, because some of us fast and don't even know it. If you don't eat for a long period of time, an extended period of time, and then the first thing you put in your mouth after fasting or after not eating for a long period of time should not be sugar, or should not be a simple carbohydrate. You have to ease your body, back into it. Hence, when I did a before I started my natural sugar lifestyle change, I did a cleanse. And what I did was I did that cleanse to rid my body of everything that's in it, all the gunk and stuff. So I did like a juice cleanse, and then I did liquid cleanse. So I just did juices and soups. And then as I got into close to reintroducing my body back into solid foods, I didn't just start with meatloaf. I didn't just start with mashed potatoes, macaroni and cheese. I started off with like vegetable soup, or soup. My soup had more vegetables in it. Then gradually I did salad, and then I did like a lean meat like fish, and then I went on to my beef and things like that. So that's what you have to do to your body so you won't spike it. In essence, you don't want to be basically causing shock to your body. So that's all he's saying. Let me digress and let y'all listen to this man explain the good information. Here we go.
Before we go to bed. So the average individual is spending every waking moment in a state of elevated insulin, and thus the signal never really goes away. because they never give themselves a break. But one of the consequences of that I mentioned, which is that it directly causes insulin resistance. But when insulin is high, it starts to have a signal on the fat cell. And that then brings us to the slow insulin resistance, where you have something happening in the fat tissue that begins to set the stage for insulin resistance in the entire body. And it takes longer to settle in, but it takes also longer to go away. That's why I call this one slow insulin resistance. Now, in the case of insulin, most people, so the key with I'll explain it this way first. So the most relevant feature with fat tissue contributing to insulin resistance is the size of each fat cell. When we typically think of fat, we would maybe say, okay, Steve has, I'll do this in kilos for the UK audience. Steve has 10 kilos of fat on your entire body. That's probably too much for you. Ben has 20 kilos. And yet, it's possible that I'm healthier metabolically than you. And that's because fat that matters most, despite universally being fatter than her male counterparts, are healthier with regards to insulin resistance and every single metabolic problem. It's because women, as a result of her particular sex hormones, have more fat cells, but they're smaller. So she has more fat, but smaller fat cells. And small fat cells are healthy, insulin-sensitive, anti-inflammatory fat cells. But the bigger the fat cell gets, the more it initiates a cascade of events or a series of events that creates insulin resistance.
And am I right in thinking we have the same amount of fat cells for our whole life, pretty much?
That's a really, really safe assumption for most people. Yeah, for most people, a fat cell, sometimes students will hear that fat cells are immortal. That is not true. But they're long-lived. Fat cells will live about 10 years. And so typically, by the time, if you look at a newborn, during infancy, childhood, and puberty, the number of fat cells is going up, 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 up. Once they finish puberty, so mid to late teens for a young woman, late teens or even early 20s for a young man, usually at that point, the number of fat cells they have is going to be very static.
This is something people don't really understand, and I actually discovered it from doing this podcast and speaking to so many experts about this, that we pretty much, especially as an adult, have the same amount of fat cells, really regardless of what we eat.
Yes.
And it's actually just the fat cells we have shrinking
or growing.
Expanding.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Now, there are differences across...
Which, by the way, makes liposuction a pretty fucking bad idea.
In fact, it makes things worse. Please, let's make sure we come back to that.
Okay, I'll break down liposuction.
Because it really becomes... The person ends up... Their vanity ends up really ruining their future metabolic outcomes. But there are differences across ethnicity. Like, this is a little oversimplified, but not much. On one end, you'd have Caucasians, kind of Northern European Caucasians. On the other end, you'd have East Asians, like Chinese, Japanese, Korean, East Asians. And then if you look at that same spectrum of people making fat cells through their life, an East Asian will be making fat cells and then stop right about here. So very few fat cells, relatively speaking, across all the ethnicities. They have very few fat cells. A Caucasian, on the other end of the spectrum, they went way higher. And so this guy, let's say American Ben versus Chinese Ben, overly simplified. But here we are. So much of fat mass isn't the number of fat cells, even though American Ben has more. It's the size of the fat cell. So I could...
Hey, Wellness with Frugal Mama, welcome in.
Really as Chinese Ben, but that would just be because my fat cells were just that much smaller. But this is the problem then. If you have, let's say, American Ben and Chinese Ben both gained 10 kilos of
Hey, the Bud Files, welcome back.
10 years. Very easily done. Most people do that quite often. Caucasian Ben just doesn't look as good in his Speedo, which as a pasty Caucasian, he's not going to look particularly good in that Speedo anyway. But I just am bulging a little more than I was before. But otherwise, I'm healthy. My blood pressure's fine. My blood sugar's fine. Everything's normal. Put that same 10 kilos of fat on Chinese Ben, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, infertility. And that is because Chinese Ben had fewer fat cells to start with. And so those fat cells, as the body was told to store fat, those fat cells were getting much, much bigger much sooner. And the fat cell promotes insulin resistance very, very readily. And so that logically moves into the question of what makes fat cells grow. And it is two essential variables that we only ever look at calories. And yet, if you take a person with type 1 diabetes and say, I want you to eat 10,000 calories, but don't give yourself your insulin injection, they cannot gain weight. It is literally impossible for the type 1 diabetic
J3.
to get fat if they are skipping their insulin injections. In fact, this is so known that if you take, let's imagine a young woman who would maybe have more pressure to be thin than her male counterpart, although it's happening more in males too. Imagine a young girl who gets diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at the age of 13 or 14. Very impressionable time. She's very worried about how she looks and how thin she is. She learns that, wait a minute, I can eat whatever I want, and all I have to do is not inject my insulin, and I'll be as skinny as I want. And it works. It works so well that it's actually a formal eating disorder called diabulimia. So the fact that this exists is absolute proof that the growing and the shrinking of the fat cell is more complicated than just calories being high or low. Because like I said earlier, when I talked about hormones, hormones are a way for the very tissues of the body to know what it ought to do with energy. And so a fat cell will have energy all around it. And if it doesn't have insulin to tell it what to do, it won't do anything with it. Or maybe to make this more direct, back home in my lab, my students are growing fat cells in petri dishes. These fat cells are swimming in a little sea of calories, lots of glucose, lots of fats, and yet they stay really small until we add insulin. The moment we add insulin into that little petri dish, if we check those cells 4 hours later, they're immediately fatter. If we check them 4 hours later, they're fatter still. Now they know what to do with the energy they have. So with
Isn't that
slow
weird?
insulin resistance, it develops when fat cells get really, really big. It's like because they have to tell insulin, you are telling me to keep growing. I can't keep growing. I'm so big that I'm going to pop. I mean, literally, the fat cell can get so big that it degrades its membrane. It's like a water balloon that a naughty little boy has overfilled and it's about to burst. The fat cell doesn't want to burst. And so it tells insulin, you are trying to make me grow. You're telling me to grow. I can't listen anymore. I'm becoming insulin resistant to stop growing.
So insulin makes you fat.
Oh, very much. Now, so a moment ago I said that the big fat cell is two variables. You must have both. You must have both a signal to tell the fat cell to get big, which is insulin. There's no other signal that can do it. You can, in a human, just simply take away the insulin, like type 1 diabetes. It doesn't matter any other hormone in the body. It does not matter. They cannot get fat. They can eat thousands. They can eat.
That's for a type 1 diabetic,
Chocolate
but
cake.
that would
They
be
cannot get
dangerous.
fat. Not only can they not get fat, they can't hold on to their fat. Because if there's no insulin to tell the fat cell to hold on to it or get big, it has to shrink. It's breaking down its fat. So the body goes into such a dramatic fat burning state in the absence of insulin that keeping fat becomes impossible. So the insulin signal is necessary to tell the fat cell what to do. But the fat cell will say, okay, insulin, you're high, you're telling me to grow, but what am I going to grow with? That's where the calories come in. Now the fat cell will say, hey, fats and glucose in the blood, insulin has told me to get big, and so I need to pull you in to help me grow. You're going to give me the bulk. And if you have one without the other, it is death.
So if I'm eating 2,000 calories and I have a different insulin sensitivity to you, so
Hey, welcome back. Garden is great.
And I'm insulin resistant, doesn't that mean that
You'll store more as fat.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So your body, now it would partly depend on. There are people where if all of your fat cells had reached its maximum point, then you're done. You're not going to gain more fat. You're just going to become more and more and more insulin resistant.
Okay, fine.
So you kind of start.
Hence, your blood sugars be high and you fat.
To show that if you give humans isocaloric meals, so the exact same number of calories, but they in the same amount of protein, but you differ those meals based on the amount of carbs to the amount of fat. So let's say 2 meals, exact same calories, 2,000 calories, or that's in one meal, that's too high. 1,000 calories in one meal. One version of this is the conventional way of eating, which is lower fat, higher carb. The other meal, same number of calories, but it's lower carb, higher fat. This lower carb, higher fat version will have a lower insulin response, and they will store less fat from that meal. And someone would say, well, where do the calories go? You can't, it's the laws of thermodynamics. You can't destroy energy. The metabolic rate will go up. So when insulin is low, if you have someone going a full day eating the same number of calories but lower carb calories, their metabolic rate will be almost 300 calories higher in that day.
And metabolic rate is the...
Yeah, that's the total amount of energy that it just costs you and I to just live.
Okay, so...
It was going through the day. But that's a significant amount. Like, if you and I were to go exercise and say, let's go burn 300 calories, we got to be on the stair stepper for an hour or something. So it's 300 calories. But at the same time, if your insulin is low, you're burning so much fat that you start making ketones. And I don't intend to get onto that topic quite yet. But suffice it to say, every molecule of a ketone has a caloric load roughly similar to glucose. And what the body, when it starts making a lot of ketones, it starts eliminating the ketones. So every time someone is breathing out ketones, they're literally breathing out calories. Or they're urinating, and they're urinating out ketones if they have higher ketones in their blood. They're urinating out calories because ketones have energy. And so this is the way that if insulin is low, it becomes impossible for the body to hold on to its energy. It is so determined to spend energy that it will both increase metabolic rate and it will make the energy, the calories, be wasted in the breath and in the urine and in the form of ketones, because ketones have calories. Ketones are energy. Now we're just dumping them out into the universe.
It's worth, before we talk about...
Okay, I hope y'all understood that. I think he explained it in a very, very good way. But let me know if y'all have any questions, and I'll try to probably try to simplify it. So he just, in essence, explained to you the relationship, the correlation between insulin type 1 and type 2 and how much you're supposed to eat. Yeah. And when you follow the diet, how you lose weight or how you don't lose weight, how you gain weight or how you don't gain weight. And then those rules apply to a person that doesn't have diabetes as well, just a regular person. Like, depending on what you eat will depend on how your body functions and what type of energy your body will, what type of calories your body will burn, or if it will burn fat or will it burn sugar. Okay?
How to keep my insulin levels low so that I can benefit from all the health benefits we talked about. It's probably also worth just spending a little bit of time trying to understand the evolutionary basis of insulin resistance.
There are some theories that are very interesting that attempt to explain why is it that we became so fantastically different.
Stay
from,
warm,
let's say,
gardening
our
is
closest
great.
animal relatives, other primates like chimpanzees or apes. What was the difference that had us become so different than them? One of the leading theories is a theory called the expensive tissue hypothesis. And it actually does have something to do with ketones. In the expensive tissue hypothesis, as the theory goes, our earlier ancestors deviated in this kind of animal family line because we started eating more meat. We started eating food that was so nutritious, so nutrient dense, so loaded with good calories and all of the fats and proteins that we need, that it allowed two very distinct changes to occur in us compared to other primates. One, our intestines became significantly shorter. So if you compare the human digestive tract to any other primate animal, if we are a primate, then if you look at the intestines, they're fantastically different, particularly the large intestine or the colon, because our ancestors, as the theory goes, began eating meat. We didn't need the colon as much, because the colon is a place for food to ferment. And so if you're eating a lot of plant matter, like other primates do, you need a much, much larger colon. So we started eating food that was so nutrient dense, our colon shrunk considerably. We didn't need to waste energy on a big, busy colon. At the same time, as we were eating food that was so nutrient dense and so loaded with good fat, it allowed us to have more time to be curious and explore.
Oh,
And
you
so at the
do? Oh,
same
okay.
time, our intestines were shrinking because we didn't need them to be so big. Our brain was growing, and it's because it had so much nutrition, including ketones. So ketones are an extraordinary fuel for the brain. In fact, one of the reasons why a baby that is born premature will be more likely to have learning disorders later in life is because premature baby didn't have time to get very fat. And fat baby is healthy baby. And fat baby gets into ketosis. Let's say you and I were to fast straight for 2 days. If you took a 6-month-old baby, that baby would be in a deeper state of ketosis in 2 hours than you and I would be in 2 days. Because the baby is burning so much of its beautiful chubby fat. And the more the body burns fat, the more it makes ketones. And the tissue of the body that appears to benefit the most in response to ketones is the brain. The brain, the moment ketones hit the blood stream, the brain immediately starts taking in ketones for a fuel. Very often, I have students who have had a professor, perhaps with the best of intentions, but ignorant nonetheless, tell the student that the main fuel for the brain is glucose, that the brain prefers glucose. And I show them just 1 or 2 papers to prove that wrong immediately. And it is reflected in this idea, which if to use some convenient UK units, if blood glucose is 5 millimolar, that's a concentration, a way of measuring an amount of something. Blood glucose may be 5 millimolar, or 80 milligrams per deciliter for the American audience. That would be a normal glucose. And if you and I were to fast for 24 or so hours, we may get up to about 1 millimolar of ketones. And yet, even then, the brain has already switched to get the majority of its energy from the ketone. And so don't tell me that in this dynamic, the brain prefers this one, because this one's 5 times higher than this one. And even in that scenario, the brain is already getting more than half of its energy from the ketone. So all of this is my long-winded way of saying, when we look at the principles of evolution, one of the leading theories is this idea that we began eating essentially a meat-heavy diet that, again, is so nutritious that it allowed our brains to grow. Maybe one final point on this, although it is a bit of a barbed comment, people may find this somewhat amusing or disappointing or frustrating. The title of a book just published, which is that vegetarians have smaller brains. This is seen in humans, that the less a human eats meat, then the smaller the brain becomes. The brain is so dependent on the nutrient density that comes from animal-sourced foods that it will suffer when it doesn't get them.
Interesting.
Okay, so we're going to pause right there because that's a lot of information. That's a lot of information that he didn't share so far. But I just wanted to pinpoint and just say it's a lot of things that stuck out to me, but to stay along the lines of the last thing that he said was in our research, we have heard over and over and over and over and over again that we wasn't humans wasn't designed or we wasn't designed to consume meat, or either some people would say as much meat as we consume. And because we started consuming more meat, our bodies started adapting or evolving to process the large amounts of meats that we were eating. So we hearing over and over and over again about consuming meat. So it is a good thing to not consume as much meat, and it's a good thing to not consume meat at all. Um, Either way is good, but research is showing that we're doing that we wasn't designed to consume as much meat as we are now. Our bodies weren't made that way, right? Because our bodies were designed, and specifically, he said our intestines were designed or composed a different way to break down those things. And now, because we kept forcing our bodies to accept the diet change, Our bodies adapted to our change. Hence, we got uh, larger brains and smaller parts of our intestines. I don't know. So my question is, which I have to do the research, the question that popped into my head when watching this is he said that vegetarians' brains are smaller. So my question would be, does their intestines revert back to the original design, or do they just get smaller brains? We're going to have to research that and find out. Because I didn't look that up yet. All right, so let's watch a little more. Let's watch a little more. Here we go.
It's a controversial thing to say.
It is, and you can cut it out. But it really is, it's a real thing. And why does depression go up so much when people stop eating animal source foods? It's because you are depriving the brain of what it needs.
What is it exactly?
Oh, wait, let me
in that situation?
Yeah.
Wait, let me rewind that. So he's talking about, when people decide to become vegetarians. So he already said that the brain gets smaller.
The title of a book just published, which is that vegetarians have smaller brains. This is seen in humans, that the less a human eats meat, then the smaller the brain becomes. The brain is so dependent on the nutrient density that comes from animal sourced foods that it will suffer when it doesn't get them.
Interesting. I mean, that's a controversial thing to say.
It is, and you can cut it out. But it really is, it's a real thing. And why does depression go up so much when people stop eating animal source foods? It's because you are depriving the brain of what it needs.
What is it exactly you're depriving the brain of in that situation?
Yeah. So at least, among other things, at least it would be the essential omega-3 fats. So there are 3 omega-3s, and we can only get one from plants, but it's one that the humans don't use. We need the other 2, and they only come from animal source foods.
Bam! Bam! So it's okay to not eat meat, but you're going to be depriving yourself of 2 amino acids that you can only get from meat.
It's supplement.
Absolutely.
Right. And
yes. Yeah, you can, but so the solution in that regard is the vegan must be educated enough to know what they're deficient in, and then wealthy enough to afford the supplements to make up for it.
There you go.
So is that the only evolutionary sort of hypothesis towards why we develop this insulin resistance?
Oh yeah. In fact, it's funny that you bring the question up again, because I realized I didn't quite answer it that way. So insulin resistance, why would it exist at all? It would probably be a way for the body to know when it was needed to hold on to energy a little better. So now, I say that now, and someone would think, well, but why would I want to hold on to energy in a way where it's causing hypertension and Alzheimer's disease and increasing risk of heart disease? Not all versions of insulin resistance are negative. So there is what all the insulin resistance that you and I have been talking about is pathological insulin resistance or harmful insulin resistance. Insulin resistance that serves no good purpose and it's making us sick. However, there is insulin resistance in human development, which is physiological or helpful. It's supposed to happen. And that is the 2 P's of physiological insulin resistance: puberty and pregnancy. Because in both of those instances, as we outlined earlier, when the body's insulin resistant, insulin is high. That's not always bad, because insulin wants things to grow. It is like a fertilizer in the body. Now, sometimes it's misplaced and results in problems, like increasing the risk of cancer, for example. But in other instances, if you have a young child who needs some explosive growth during puberty, well, then that's really helpful. Insulin's telling the body to store more energy, to build up tissues, including muscle and bone, but also including fat.
So in pregnancy, insulin's playing a role in growing the placenta.
It sure is.
The breasts.
Yeah, so in the woman, after she's finished puberty,
listen to this.
The only time of growth she'll ever have will be pregnancy. And so those are the 2 instances where the body has become insulin resistant to take advantage of the heightened scenario where it can grow.
Because the woman's body needs more fat.
Oh, goodness, yes. Yes, so her body not only needs to grow tissue mass, like the uterus has to get much bigger, she has to grow a placenta. She also needs to become a little insulin resistant to give a little more glucose to her baby, because she is, after all, now living for two people. And so, as her body becomes insulin resistant, it actually facilitates the growth of the baby a little more rapidly. But as you noted, it helps her store more fat, and progesterone is another hormone that even accelerates that process. But basically, it's her body's way of saying, hey, I am committing to growing another human, and it's going to be metabolically very demanding. And so I'm going to have as much extra fat or as much extra energy as I can in order to ensure that if there's any sort of scarcity in food that happens during the course of the pregnancy, I'll have enough energy to get through it all. And then maybe I'll even have enough to continue to feed the baby with lactation after the baby's born.
What is gestational diabetes?
Ah,
Yeah, it's a great question.
pause. Let me pause before he dropped the bomb on that. So I just want to say, women, don't worry about getting fat when you pregnant. You're supposed to, okay? You supposed to. That's healthy because you growing a whole human. Now listen to this bomb dropper about the gestational diabetes, okay? Please put your listening ears on.
Gestational diabetes is essentially type 2 diabetes of pregnancy. So it's a perfectly timed question, because if you look at the average woman who is very healthy, very insulin sensitive at the beginning of her pregnancy, so glucose is normal and insulin is normal. Over the course of her pregnancy, she stays normal, healthy pregnant woman, which is to say she has physiological insulin resistance. She doesn't get diagnosed with gestational diabetes, though, which means her glucose is normal. But to keep her glucose normal, because she is insulin resistant, but for a purpose to help her body grow, her insulin levels are high, and then the glucose is still in a normal range. And then in some women, especially if she has a family history of type 2 diabetes, the insulin resistance goes too far. Now she has high insulin, like all pregnant women do, but she's not able to keep her glucose levels in check.
So if I'm eating loads and loads of sugar throughout pregnancy,
That will compound the problem. Absolutely. So then she will go from the normal insulin resistance of pregnancy into the insulin resistance of diabetes. So it really is like type 2 diabetes, but a microcosm of it, a mini version that was really instigated or initiated because of the pregnancy, combined with a bit of a genetic predisposition, combined with her eating the worst possible way.
does that then impact the future baby?
Oh, for sure it does. Yeah. So think about, it's almost like the baby is literally developing in a hyperglycemic, hyperinsulinemic environment. So the baby gets hardwired to want to continue to exist in a state of high insulin and high glucose after the baby is born. And so yes, the offspring of mothers who have gestational diabetes are significantly more likely to gain weight and be chubbier or fatter than their counterparts, and to later develop type 2 diabetes. Yeah, a resounding yes.
I read in your book that these infants have a 40% higher chance to be obese and have metabolic complications in their teenage years and beyond.
Yes, I mean, a significant thing. And I say that with all of the sympathy I can for the mother who may be struggling with this. But it is certainly a motivation for mom to just be mindful of what you're eating.
One of the things.
Okay, so I'm gonna pause right there. So, the bomb dropper for me is like they will say some things are not genetic. This is the link that is genetic, and I'm not gonna say proof, but it's a great explanation, a great different point of view, might I say, to how you can be born with these things, because your genetic information or your makeup or the information of how your body is going to develop, you're getting that from the atmosphere that's being created inside the womb. And so the baby gets used to one particular situation, to where when it is born, it is fighting odds to try to maintain that same environment. So for those mothers who, hey, Urban, welcome in. Yes, from the environment. So from those mothers who may be pregnant, and you get that test and it's letting you know that you have gestational diabetes. Number one, that means you have to be more mindful of what you eat. Don't eat so much carbs and sugary foods. You don't want to. Hey, she said she from the bushes. Be mindful of what you're eating because you're creating that environment. You're basically creating the habits for that child to follow once it gets out. So you want to be able to give them a good start, a running start, a solid foundation. You don't want to bring them into this world fighting already. We got a whole bunch of other things that we need to be fighting against. So pay attention to what you're eating, especially right, creating an addiction. Thank you, Urban. You want to be careful, especially if you take that test and you are diagnosed with gestational diabetes. Back up off of that stuff and think about that child. You want to give that child a fighting chance. You don't want to birth them into this world with the odds stacked against them on that issue already. Okay? So let's continue.
That I saw the other day on social media, which I wanted to ask you about, was this. I've got a picture of it here. There was someone online that posted this photo, and they said, well, this graph, and they said, we need to figure out what's going on here. And this is the graph. I'll put it on screen for anybody that's watching, but also it will be linked in the comment section below. It essentially shows that over the last, let's say, 20 years, there's been a really significant rise in cancer amongst women, but when we look at cancer amongst men, it's pretty flat. And this is cancer incidence by age and gender up to 49 years old. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on why
Thank
this
you,
is
Angela.
happening.
Yes, it's really good
Yeah, a few
information.
thoughts come to mind. Whenever I see these kinds of reports, I always make sure I look firstly at what are they actually measuring. So just to set the stage, this is the number of women who are being diagnosed with cancer. So not dying from cancer, but it's going up. So one simple explanation, although perhaps the most disappointing, could be that more women are going in for testing younger. And so we're just seeing kind of an artifact of women are just going in sooner and they're detecting a problem that they wouldn't have otherwise detected, for 10 or 20 years, which is a good thing. You want to detect cancer as soon as possible. So that's the boring answer, that it could be a reflection of just more women going in for ultrasounds or MRIs or mammary scans, whereas men don't ever get tested for anything, which is why we die more from everything.
Men,
possibly. But
shame on
to
y'all.
give a more exciting answer, this is very, very likely almost entirely driven by breast cancer. Breast cancer is the main cancer for women by far. And so if I had to guess, I bet almost all of this increase in cancer incidence is because of breast cancer. Why might that be going up? I would suggest there's probably a couple instances. One, although people might not appreciate this, is that one of the best ways for a woman to reduce her risk of breast cancer is actually having babies. It's very well known, very well documented, that if a woman has babies and breastfeeds, her risk of breast cancer goes down. So yeah, in fact, it's very meaningful. I actually don't know.
Feed them babies. Feed them babies.
The changes in estrogens during lactation phase.
I've just actually done a quick search here I put a picture of that graph into AI and asked it the same question, and it said pretty much what you said. It said there's a rising breast cancer incidence according to Cancer Research UK. The other one that it came up with is obesity trends.
Oh yeah, I promised I was going to talk about that. I wouldn't leave that. Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting there.
No problem.
And then the other one was delayed childbearing.
That's what I'm saying.
Which is what you were saying.
Yeah. So as childbirth rates are going down, it does increase the risk of breast cancer. Now, I'm a cell biologist, right? I like to understand a direct mechanism, and so as much as I invoke the perhaps lower rates of childbirth among women, I don't know the mechanisms, so I'm sort of loath to describe it. The mechanisms I'm very familiar with are the metabolic, which is if you take breast tissue that is tumor tissue and compare it to, like if you take a breast tumor and compare it to the normal tissue right next to it, like that it would have shared its origins with, the cancer from the breast will have 7 times more insulin receptors than the normal breast tissue. So the idea of this tracking quite nicely with obesity rates going up over the past 20 years, I wouldn't say that it's the obesity per se but I would say it's the entire metabolic milieu, which is the insulin resistance. That as much as the high insulin is promoting fat cells getting bigger, that high insulin is also accelerating the growth of the tumor cells. Because again, one of the main mutations in breast cancer is a sevenfold, so a 7 times increase in the number of insulin receptors. And insulin wants to tell things to grow. So it's no surprise that almost every tumor that's ever been measured for having insulin receptors will have a lot more. It's basically telling its neighboring cells, insulin's going to come by and it's going to tell us all to grow. I want to grow more than you. And that's what cancer is. Cancer is growth, unregulated growth.
Yeah.
Insulin tells things to grow. So the connection between obesity with the rising incidence of breast cancer is very, very likely a consequence of the rising incidence of insulin resistance.
As you guys know, Whoop is one of my show sponsors. It's also a company that I have invested
Okay,
in.
so
That's one that you guys
I
asked me
hope
about.
you guys
The
are
next question that was asked
enjoying
is why
the
I
great
use Whoop
information
over.
that we are having. Of course, he doing his little spiel about the commercial, but I hope you guys are getting this. It's a whole lot. It's a whole lot of information in here. He haven't even gotten to some of the jaw dropping things that he's gonna discuss in this video. But let me get to it. Let me get to it. I don't want to hold y'all up because it's a lot on this video. Let me see if I can fast forward.
You can head to join.whoop. They think of Alzheimer's as and try Whoop for 30
Okay,
days,
here we go.
risk-free and zero commitment. That's join.whoop.com/CEO. Let me know how you get on. You know, one of the big subjects you touched on at the start was the
You're welcome.
Alzheimer's and dementia.
Yes.
And I have heard several people on this podcast tell me that they think of Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes. Worldwide, there is a new case of dementia every 3.2 seconds. It seems like, I don't know if this is true, but is Alzheimer's and dementia on the rise?
Oh, yes. Yeah, it is. In fact, it went from not being even on the radar to being a top 10 killer. Now, it's interesting how people even die from Alzheimer's disease. It's a very kind of vague death. But yeah, Alzheimer's disease is one of the top 10 diseases now, certainly in the West. And I would argue it's because it has a metabolic origin. Now, one of the interesting things about Alzheimer's disease is we have spent billions of dollars on Alzheimer's research trying to identify the plaque. So just to set the stage
Yes.
here so that people listening can appreciate this paradigm shift that's occurred in Alzheimer's research. Originally, and even in many people still, people thought that Alzheimer's disease is the result of these plaques accumulating in the brain.
Y'all remember that? I gotta pause that. When I was in nursing school, that's what they taught us. That the reason for Alzheimer's is because of the plaque build up in the blood vessels of your brain. Hence, they would say that because of this plaque, you have decreased blood flow, and when you have the decreased blood flow, you have decreased of oxygen depriving that part of your brain. So that's why you have the malfunction. Hey, sunshine, welcome in. Same thing with the heart. They tell you have hypertension because of the increased plaque on the inside of your blood vessels in your heart, and it makes it the blood vessels inside of the blood vessels the lining walls of the blood vessels become thicker in the inside, so that it decreases the amount of space that the blood has to travel through, and so and it increases the amount of pressure, so the heart has to pump harder to get all of that blood through that small space. That's what they told us, right? It's not plaque. We've talked about this in our other research about when we did the inflammation of, basically when we were studying the causes of all things, and we found out it's because of inflammation. Inflammation is, things are inflamed. Okay, I digress. Hey, Analytic Gardener, welcome in. Let's finish watching. Let's finish watching. I said I wasn't gonna stop it.
A little proteinaceous, little thick things that are preventing neurons from sending the signals throughout the brain for the brain to think and have normal cognition. And yet, there are those of us, and I'm proud to say I have long been one of them, who has said that the plaque-based theory doesn't make sense. We have had drugs that have been available for human use for years that have effectively reduced plaques in the brain.
And they
and
still
yet did
have it.
nothing to improve
Still
cognition.
have
So
dementia.
that is an immediate challenge of the plaque-based theory of Alzheimer's. Even further, even beyond older than that evidence, when you would look post-mortem or look at tissue donor people who passed away, you would look at the brains of people who died with confirmed Alzheimer's disease at the time of death, and look at the brain of someone who died without any evidence of any cognitive decline or any compromised thinking whatsoever. And you would be just as likely to find plaques in both brains. So whether the brain had Alzheimer's disease or not, you would still see plaques in the brain. So the whole idea that plaques mattered has long been controversial. And just to put a fine point on it, before transitioning to the metabolic origins, about 2 or 3 years ago, they found out that the very first published papers that implicated plaque as a cause of Alzheimer's disease were based on fabricated data. So the scientists who published
Somebody
those
lied.
reports that led to the entire theory that Alzheimer's disease is plaque-based were called out as fraudulent, and indeed all of it was fabricated. So the entire idea that Alzheimer's and
Ain't that something?
billions of dollars on studies to try to determine how do plaques cause Alzheimer's disease. Why, when we reduce plaques, it doesn't appear to help.
Think about how many people died because
plaques
somebody
have nothing to do
lied.
with it. That's just something that some brains have. Some brains have more of these little specks than other brains, and they don't contribute to Alzheimer's disease at all. Now, what kept rising to the top, and I would hope now is the dominant theory, is that people with Alzheimer's disease almost always have some detectable instance of insulin resistance, if not full-on diabetes, type 2 diabetes. Now, I will say personally, I don't like the term type 3 diabetes because it makes it sound like it's a whole new version of diabetes. To say it more
You right,
succinctly and
Sylvia.
accurately, it is simply insulin resistance of the brain. And the brain is a very hungry organ. It is in what I teach as a trinity of high metabolic rate organs. That there are 3 organs in the body whose metabolic rate is so high that it just really sets it apart from everything else. And the brain is one of them. The brain has a very high metabolic rate. So this is a very hungry organ that needs a lot of energy all the time. But the brain is unique in that it primarily will only use 2 fuel sources, and I've mentioned them, namely glucose and ketones. But glucose, in that section of the brain that gets compromised with Alzheimer's disease, the glucose can't just come straight in. It needs someone to open the door for it, and that is insulin, of course, just like we described with the muscle cell, where in order for the glucose to go into the muscle, insulin had to come and knock on the door, if you will. And then the muscle, being a polite, responsive host, would open and allow the glucose to come in. The brain is similar. That in that section of the brain, it has doors that need insulin. It's locked until insulin comes and opens them. So even though glucose levels may be high in the blood, like in type 2 diabetes, you would think, well, the brain can just get all the glucose it wants. And yet it cannot, because it has insulin regulating the entrance of the glucose. And if the brain is insulin resistant, there's not enough glucose coming in. And thus the brain is forced to rely on the only other fuel that it can rely on, namely ketones. But the same person who's eating all the time to keep their blood glucose high all the time has so much insulin in their blood that they're never making enough ketones to fill the gap. You know, and you mind the gap. And the brain has an energy gap now, and where the brain needs, you know, an amount of energy. I'm kind of acting it out for those that are watching, but the brain has a certain energy demand that it needs. And if there's a lot of glucose in a healthy insulin-sensitive person, glucose will fill all of that need. But as the brain becomes progressively insulin resistant, it cannot get all of its energy from glucose. And thus there's an energetic gap. And in the absence of ketones, there's nothing to fill that gap.
So
And
what
the brain
happens?
says, well, I don't have enough energy to keep functioning as well as I did before, so I have to reduce my function, which manifests as a reduction in the ability to think and process.
Bam! There you go. That is what Alzheimer's is. So this whole video, he been talking about keeping the balance with the insulin so that the insulin can open the door for other things to come in. And in this situation, he's talking about glucose. So in your brain, if the insulin cannot get to that part of the brain or is at that part of the brain and that part of the brain is resistant to insulin, it's not going to get the glucose that it needs to function. And if the ketones, like he said, the other hormone is not there to get it into the brain to get it to function, then it doesn't function. That's how you lose the function of that brain, because you have a breakdown of the process, not because something is plaque buildup, because this process can still happen with plaque buildup. Insulin can still function with plaque buildup, which is what he told you before earlier. He was like, people with the without plaque, you know, it didn't matter. So whether a person has plaque on their brain, they still can function. All right, let's keep going.
In other words, cognition goes down. What's so interesting is I just got finished describing a scenario that scientists refer to as brain glucose hypometabolism, or a reduction in the amount of
Hey,
glucose the brain is
Storms.
using. There are scientists that measured this. We don't in my lab because we don't do these kinds of techniques. But you can actually infuse people with the glucose that you can take pictures of and see how much the brain is taking it in and metabolizing it. In Alzheimer's disease, the brain is not getting as much glucose, so they call that a hypo, or a reduction in metabolism of glucose. And as much as you and I are describing that scenario as relevant for Alzheimer's disease, you can essentially open up the book of neurological disorders and see the same thing.
All right,
Depression
analytics. See you
has a
later.
brain
Thank you for
glucose
coming.
hypometabolism to it. Migraines have a brain glucose hypometabolism. Epilepsy and Parkinson's disease. So all of these disorders of the brain, of the central nervous system, the one thing they all have in common is the brain isn't getting enough energy from glucose. And another way of saying that is the one thing all of those seemingly unrelated brain problems have in common is that they all have some degree of insulin resistance. But then it's no surprise that they all benefit when ketones can swoop in to save the day. But that only can happen if the person is giving their body a break from the insulin long enough to actually start making ketones.
Really, really interesting on this point of Alzheimer's, because I don't think people have spent enough time talking about the link between insulin resistance and Alzheimer's.
We're going to go for about
And
5 more minutes, guys, and then I'm going to shut it down for the day.
one I was looking at there was how many people with Alzheimer's meet the criteria for insulin resistance. And some studies have it at 40%. There's a study I found here that has it at 70 to 80%, which I wanted to cite. Exact percentages vary, but one example is a study in the Journal of Neurology in 2011 that found insulin resistance at approximately 40% of individuals with Alzheimer's. But another study in Alzheimer's patients sometimes found it to be as high as 70 or 80%. For instance, research by Dr. Suzanne De La Monte at Brown University has drawn attention to the concept of type 3 diabetes.
Yeah, again, I don't love the term, but I appreciate the use of it, which is, it does suggest a metabolic origin. But even you look at those ranges, Stephen, you'd say, well, one was 40, one was 80. Boy, what a difference. I suspect a lot of that is just how did they measure insulin resistance?
Right.
If they were looking at the glucose, like so many do, you're just going to miss a lot of people.
Yeah, it's quite hard to. I think there's different criteria, right, for how one defines someone as insulin resistant.
Well, yeah, and that's right. That's because there's not enough training, which is at the beginning of the conversation. You asked my mission. One of my missions is to help people learn what to look for.
What do they need to be looking for?
Yeah, they need to be looking at insulin. So,
is that easy to measure?
Well, it is technically easy to measure. It's just that we don't have enough systems in place to enable it. Like again, if someone listening in the UK were to go to their GP and say, can you measure my insulin? In many instances, they literally can't get it done. The system just isn't in place to take it to the lab and measure it. Now, some do. I know some physicians in the UK who do so, and they have developed their own way of getting it done. And they're incredible advocates of this whole idea. But it is harder in the UK and in Canada, where the system is such that they have said, out of ignorance, but perhaps well placed or well intentioned, they will say, well, insulin isn't a marker that matters. It is. And if you're measuring insulin resistance, just to put things back to where we had talked about it earlier, many people with insulin resistance have normal blood glucose levels. It's the insulin that's high. And so I would say if a person can get their insulin measured, get it measured. In US units, if it is anything above about 10 microunits per mil, that's a warning. In UK units, if it's anything above about 40 picomoles, that's a warning. Insulin is high, you could have insulin resistance.
And you could be skinny.
Oh, yes.
And have insulin resistance.
Yes, that's especially depending on the ethnicity. Like if someone listening to this is East Asian and they say, well, I'm quite thin, I don't have insulin resistance, you very well could. It depends. Even in young women, a group out of northern Canada, which is, of course, pretty far north, they found that even in young, healthy weight women with PCOS, if they compared them to their identically matched other women without PCOS, they were more insulin resistant than the other group. So anyway, that's my way of saying, even if you look at yourself and think, well, I'm kind of lean, I'm not insulin resistant, you very well could be.
Okay, so I've got a friend who's a woman who has PCOS.
Yeah.
And one of the things that she often says to me is that she gains weight easily. Is this true?
Oh, for sure. And in fact, I wouldn't be surprised if she does, because the fact that she has PCOS is not absolute evidence, but very likely evidence that she has insulin resistance.
Yep.
Which would mean at any given moment, her insulin is at the risk of being a little higher than her non-insulin resistant counterparts.
So if she goes and gets the test done,
I bet her insulin would be high. And so all that would mean is...
Women with
which is good. I mean,
PCOS, get your
knowledge is
insulin
power.
levels checked.
And my hope would be that as someone goes and gets their insulin measured, and there are a handful of other tests they could also look at, but that's the most succinct, then it would be all the more impetus or encouragement to say, okay, I listened to Stephen and Ben, I really do need to start making some changes. And even in PCOS, there are reports that document the absolute reversal of the disease with nothing more than just dietary changes.
I was looking also a second ago because we mentioned ethnicity a few times, and it says, the research I was looking at says that East Asians have fewer fat cells and they're more resistant to obesity-related metabolic issues.
Well, that's second part of that statement is not true. They're more resistant to obesity, but they are it's an interesting dichotomy.
Okay, I got you.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
you like to find a Japanese man who's as
Polycystic
fat as
ovary
North American,
disease.
boy, you're gonna have to look. It's hard.
That's
hard,
what
but to find a Japanese
PCOS
man who
stands for.
has- is just as
Polycystic
much
ovary
likely to get
well,
diabetes
syndrome.
as
Polycystic
Very
ovary
easy.
syndrome.
Africans have more fat cells typically.
Yeah, so on that ethnicity, if now there's a lot of kind of wiggle room here, but on one end we'd have Caucasians, blacks would be right nearby, African ethnicities would be quite close to the kind of Northern European ethnicity, and then we would move through, and I don't mean to miss anyone here, but on the other end would be East Asian, and then sprinkled through that would be Latino. Latino would be somewhere in the middle, and Hispanic, and then other Southeast Asian and then East Asian, kind of on the worst end, or the least sensitive, or the most sensitive to their fat, the most sensitive to their fat. This actually is a concept that has been presented called the personal fat threshold, which is this really interesting idea born from a group in Australia suggesting that across every individual body, which of course is heavily influenced by both ethnicity and sex, like we mentioned earlier, a body is going to have a rate at which it can store fat in a healthy way. And then once that threshold is met, any further pressure to store fat will start creating insulin resistance. And that threshold is essentially how many fat cells do you have and how much room do they have. So if you have more fat cells, you have a higher fat threshold. You can get fatter before it starts to hurt you.
Does your fat distribution also matter here?
Oh, it does.
Different races, this research is telling me, have different fat distribution. It's saying that Africans have better fat distribution, lower visceral fat, and less metabolic risk because of that.
Yeah.
Caucasians, moderate fat cell quantity, more prone to subcutaneous fat accumulation,
Subcutaneous.
That's the fat around the organs.
Yeah,
right?
so Caucasians, so let's say Northern European, African, both store more of their fat subcutaneously, which is the fat just
we'll
beneath the skin,
elaborate
the
in a
fat
second,
you can pinch and jiggle.
Sylvia.
That has an ability to expand more because there's nothing really to limit it. However, the other place for people to store fat is their visceral adipose, which is the fat that is tucked within the abdominal cavity, so tucked around the organs. It's sort of surrounding the kidneys and the intestines and the liver. That is an unhealthy place to gain fat. But in East Asian, all things equal, is putting much more fat there than they are subcutaneously. The advantage of subcutaneous fat is
which is the fat on the outside.
Yeah. So the
like
fat
belly
beneath
fat.
the skin, the loose belly fat, the fat that can pinch and jiggle. That fat has a greater ability to make new fat cells. So as much as earlier you and I said fat cells remain static, for the most part they do. There's a little bit of wiggle room where it can go up, and that's purely subcutaneous.
And Hispanics have higher fat cell quantity, more visceral fat.
Yes.
And increased risk of obesity-related conditions.
Yes, and so the problem with visceral fat is this is such a finite space. There's so little room within the core of your body that if we allow those fats to multiply, it could theoretically start physically compressing on tissues.
Right.
And so those fat cells only grow through hypertrophy, which is the thing we talked about earlier with slow insulin resistance. Subcutaneous fat cells are more abundant but smaller. Visceral fat cells are fewer but much larger. And so any ethnicity, including Hispanic or Asian, that promotes relatively more fat storage in the visceral space is going to suffer from the consequences of that fat much sooner. And again, it still comes back to size. The bigger the fat cell, the sicker the fat cell.
Okay, we're going to pause right there, and I'm going to pull up, Sylvia had a question about the PCOS in women. It's a term that we hear excuse me, I had y'all just bobbling all over everywhere. So I'm going to pull up what it has, what I have found. So hope y'all can see. Okay, so PCOS is a syndrome, basically a hormone disorder. It says it affects like childbearing women, where it causes irregular menstrual periods, excess hair growth, and infertility. What is it? It is a hormonal imbalance that occurs when the ovaries here, create excess hormones. Okay, when it creates excess hormones, these are the symptoms that we read above that you will have. You have irregular menstrual periods, excess hair growth, and infertility. And look, like he was saying in our research, people with PCOS are at higher risk for certain health conditions like diabetes and high blood pressure. But from the video we're watching today, the insulin can be the cause of the PCOS, and the high blood pressure. Okay. So when it causes an imbalance in your hormones and you are exhibiting those signs and symptoms, you could possibly very well have PCOS. Okay. And this is a picture is just showing what happens when you have PCOS. It causes you to because your hormones are imbalanced, the eggs that you do produce are not fully mature. So you get like what they say, instead of your eggs being filled with the um, reproductive cells and things it has, it just be filled with fluid and it can't make a baby. Hence why you have infertility as one of the signs and symptoms. And yeah, that's what they would call PCOS. That was a easier way um, to explain it. But this is common in women in childbearing years. So we have a lot of information that we have been listening to today. And we've listened to about an hour of the video. The video is almost 3 hours long. 2 hours and 43 minutes and 50 seconds. There's no way I'm not going to sit here and do this. But we'll watch some more together later. If you guys don't get a chance to watch it on your own, we can watch it some more together later and finish it up tomorrow. We'll watch some more tomorrow. If I don't get downloaded with some more stuff, I'm just going to work on getting rid of some more fat. Yes. Yes. And if I don't get downloaded with something more important to go on, we're going to finish this on tomorrow. But how does this relate to gardening? Okay, and the title that I said, eat, eat to live. You have to understand what you need to be eating and the purpose for you to be eating. We went over in the video the relationship of how the importance of eating proteins, and if you don't eat it, you need to have that supplement. It's okay to be vegan, but you need to have those supplements because there are amino acids that your body needs to do certain functions, and it only gets it from a meat source. So if you're not going to do that, then reach out to your healthcare professional so that you can get the supplements that you need so that you won't become insulin resistance and causes other diseases. You might not present as diabetic, but if you're a vegetarian and you got hypertension, you got high cholesterol, arthritis, lupus, other diseases, it could be because you're insulin resistant because you're not eating the things that you need to eat and your body is not being able to go through these processes that it need to go through in order for it to be healthy. Okay, so I hope that you guys have enjoyed what we have went over so far. It was a plethora of information. It was a whole lot to download. So I want to just say thank you guys for bearing with me. Even though we did 3 parts, I'm going to have to go back and label it so those who are catching the replay will know that this is 1, 2, and 3. So I thank y'all for being here with me. I hope there was something that was said and we watched that will help you to be a better person and to be more knowledgeable while we out here in the garden and know exactly what you're doing and be able to explain to somebody why you growing what you growing and be able to break it down to them the importance of these things and not just saying, well, I'm just eating it because I'm eating this because I don't want to be diabetic. I'm eating this because I have hypertension. I'm a vegetarian. I'm not gonna eat meat because of so and so. We're gonna be smart about this, and we're gonna be able to teach other people the importance of why they need to be growing this food and how they can use the food that they grow to be healthy or be your best self. Okay. Hey, thank you, David. Thank you, David. Wanda Carr, welcome in, and we about to say goodbye. But again, thank you all. I appreciate you all so much. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your Tuesday, and I will see you guys in these YouTube streets. Peace, love, and blessings, everyone. See y'all later.